India is moving forward in the role of Vishwamitra, a friend who can be trusted, a partner who believes in people-centric development, a voice that believes in global good, an engine of growth in the global economy, a technology hub for finding solutions, a powerhouse of talented youth, and a democracy that delivers. Viewers, you would have often heard Prime Minister Narendra Modi make this speech in a number of his speeches, projecting India's rising global profile. Revolving around this theme, particularly highlighting how India today is building momentum and presenting itself as a viable leader and dependable friend, is the much acclaimed book titled Friends, India's Closest Strategic Partners, authored by Professor Dr. Sreeram Chaulia. Professor Chaulia is Dean, Jindal School of International Affairs and Director General, Jindal India Institute. He's a leading opinion columnist on world affairs and a commentator on international current issues. You would have often seen him on TV debates, including on Sansad TV. So it gives me immense pleasure today to welcome Dr. Sreeram Chaulia to Sansad TV podcast, where we'll be talking to him about his latest book, in which he's written about some of India's most important bilateral relationships. Dr. Chaulia, thank you once again for joining us on Sansad TV podcast. It's always a pleasure to hear your insights about Indian foreign policy. First of all, allow me to congratulate you on behalf of Sansad TV on your 6th singly authored book, Friends, India's Closest Strategic Partners. I've had the privilege to read your book from cover to cover. Before we delve deep into the content of the book, one interesting question always that I find in your books is the cover pictures. The Crunch Time, I remember, had the picture of Prime Minister Modi. He was dressed in camouflage, and there was a very significant message that perhaps you sought to deliver through that image. This one as well has a very interesting image. What's the story and the idea behind the cover of this book?
Thank you, Teena. It's always an honor. A pleasure is mine. So the cover has the 7 most consequential partners of India, and what I've tried to do here is to represent them as involved in a complex kind of combinations that all lead up to India, and to show that these are our closest friends. We actually have 36 or so strategic partnerships officially signed, but I'm only taking what I consider to be the 7 most important in terms of economic, military and geopolitical significance for us. So these are the 7, and you can see Russia on top, but with the line that is not connected to the rest of them, and we can talk about the internal politics among our friends. We have the US, we have France, we have Israel, we have Australia, we have Japan, and we have the United Arab Emirates. So they are all, the lines are leading up to India one way or the other. With Russia, it's a separate track because of the severe polarization in international politics and the division between Russia and China, which are de facto in one camp. And China, of course, is not among our friends. It's actually our adversary, and so it's not on the cover. But maybe if the Russian line were to be stretched a little further this way, you'll see a big PRC, People's Republic of China flag there, and they have their own networks of alliances and partnerships to counter this network. But India is in a sweet spot, I'm showing, because we have the advantage of having both the Russian friendship and also the friendship of the US and its extended set of allies and partners.
Exactly as I thought so when I looked at the cover, that there would be a story. The analyst in you would actually help us understand the significance of why you chose to go with this cover. Now let's understand about the content. You've highlighted 7 major bilateral strategic partnerships, and you've sort of corroborated that with a number of case studies, a number of references. You've also quoted a number of political thinkers. I lost count after a while the number of political thinkers that I read about. Tell us about what prompted you to dive so deep into the subject of strategic partnerships. Was it some event? Was it during one of your shows that you anchor on Indian diplomacy that prompted you to go ahead and write a book on this interesting subject?
Yeah, Teena, actually the international relations, the scholarship, it's all based on area studies and individual country specialization. So a lot of people, for example, write books only on India's strategic partnership with Japan, or with Australia, or with the US, or with Russia. So there was actually one big lacuna, which is to bring all our major partners under one roof in the form of a single book. So this was much needed because people need to have the big picture of how these friends fit into India's overall grand strategy. So this is meant to appeal to a broader audience, not just the ones who are interested only in, say, India Japan, or only in India France, or only in India Israel, but rather to see how these friends, like I said, are part of a kind of a complex network that lead up to India. And on that count, there hasn't been a book. So I've been, I'm as a social scientist, I'm trained to think what are the gaps in the existing literature. How can I fill a gap? That's the fundamental point, inquiry, and then the ideas come. And the second reason I did this on strategic partnerships was because, the trigger, you asked about an event. So I start the book with the G20 summit in 2023, which we were hosting. It's a big multilateral gathering, 20 members and then many other who had been invited. It was like our, showpiece extravaganza of Indian diplomacy, right? And there was a crisis, there was a nail-biting tension, and then it all dissipated because we could get the consensus of the G20 despite these sharp divisions I'm talking about with Russia and China on one side and the Western countries on the other side. And why was that so? So if you actually probe deeper into what has come out in the public light, it's quite clear that we could succeed in this multilateral setting because of our strong bilateral partnerships with individual countries. So in a way, Dr. Subramanian Jaishankar, our external affairs minister, launched my book, and he was saying that this is diplomacy 101, meaning the fundamental is always bilateral. It's only through these webs of bilateral partnership that we can build something bigger like consensus in G20 or on other global issues. So what I realize is that this is really the building block, and sometimes we get lost in this multilateral razzmatazz. There's like a lot of publicity and glitz around it because it looks like at one time 20, 30, 40 countries are acknowledging India's leadership, right? And that is true, but how do we get to that point, where we are able to say that we are a bridge builder between East and West, North and South, all those things that we say, right? It's because we have these core strategic partnerships with individual countries, and we have been nurturing them very, very patiently and with a lot of effort and creativity. So I thought the bilateral should come back into the focus. Sometimes we lose focus of the bilateral, we just take it for granted. And my point in the book is these friendships are not all set in stone. They have evolved over time. Some new friendships have been formed, some old existing ones have been refurbished for current needs and for the current era. So the whole idea is that people should know who we can really trust and depend on, and why they look up to India in turn. This book is not, of course, from an Indian viewpoint, but it's also showing why these countries value India's friendship so much. What do they get from us? It's not only what we are getting from them, so it's a two-way street, and that is the core of bilateral, and so I try to show, and of course I then show how these bilaterals can be the basis for doing trilateral, minilateral, plurilateral, and ultimately the big, grand spectacles like G20, which is multilateral. Yeah. So we have to start with bilateral.
You're right, and that leads me to the next question on the friendships in today's polarized world. It's unfortunate I missed the grand launch of your book, but I did hear the panel discussions at the event, and I did hear the External Affairs Minister. He reiterated the point on Vishwamitra. He said India, of course, likes to have as many friends as possible, but friends, he also at the same time mentioned, it's a very innocent word, because friendship in today's times isn't without the interests converging. How significant is friendships of these countries that you've mentioned in your book to India in this phase of our journey where we aspire to become a developed country by 2047?
Yeah, so to be a developed country by 2047, to be a leading power in the world, equal to China, equal to the US, we have the potential, and we are often labeled as a would-be great power. We are not yet there, right? So what I'm arguing is actually, apart from rapid economic growth that is sustained over decades, and apart from military modernization, these are like the hardware side of rising powers, right? But you also need the software side, which is the relationship building, the diplomacy, and the goodwill of the important players in the international community. Without a favorable global environment, we cannot rise. If there are a lot of obstacles and people trying to prevent our rise or block our rise, I mean, China, our adversary, is trying to block our rise. We can talk about adversary, but the friends that I've shown in this book are actually enabling our rise, and it's without them, it's not complete. The journey to a great power status or leading power status. You can't just be a very big, prosperous country or a very strong military, but if you are friendless, you're going to struggle to have that kind of global influence that a great power should have. So it's very important that we invest in these relationships. That's what we have seen in the Modi era. They have really doubled down on these strategic partnerships. We have elevated many of them from, first we signed strategic partnership, then we make them comprehensive strategic, then we comprehensive global strategic. We keep adding these prefixes, special and privileged strategic. Why do we do that? It is to show that, okay, initially you are my friend, then you became my best friend, now you are my best friend forever, if you like, or something even more superlative than that. So we are showing that our rise and the elevation of these friendships, they are like concomitant, they happen simultaneously.
In physical terms, it's said it's rare to have friends without benefits. In diplomatic terms, can we say India has today friends, and especially if we talk about these 7 countries that you've mentioned, friends without any kind of interests converging?
No, of course, we have shared interests, and like I said, there are economic, military, and also geopolitical. And one of the points I make in the book is that it's not enough if you are doing a lot of trade or a lot of investment with a country. That itself does not make that country our closest friend, right? It's not enough if you are buying and selling weapons and doing some joint production of advanced arms and ammunition. That itself again is not sufficient. We also need these countries, these friends, to enable us to expand our own footprint away from our own immediate neighborhood. So the mark of a leading power or great power is a country who's got a influence and sway far away from its immediate surroundings, right? For that to happen, we need these friends, because they are all drawn, as you can see, from different continents and different parts of the world. What they do is they give us they're like beachheads from which, or launching points from which we can expand our influence into other regions of the world. So these are the interests, and of course shared values, I would say it's a mixed bag, because out of these 7 friends, only 5 can be called democracies, which have got similar kind of systems or comparable systems to ours. UAE and Russia cannot be called democracies. These are authoritarian countries. Yeah. So, but nonetheless, I think the interests are so convergent between all of them, including the non-democracies. So I would say it's more of a realpolitik based approach, where we are gaining a lot from them and they are gaining a lot from us. And sometimes the values intersect, like in Indo-Pacific, the Quad countries, they're all there, like Japan, Australia, US, right? With them we have the shared values approach, because we are all trying to counterbalance the authoritarian China, but the others are not so, so I think I would say it's more I would say the weight of the interests overrides the values in deciding who our friendships are. We can't be so judgmental, because nobody is a saint in the world, not even the US. Most of their close allies and partners are also authoritarian. So values, I think, are less significant, but where they intersect, we also try to extract more out of that shared vision of the world.
Whenever there are bilateral visits, either our leaders go to that respective country or their leaders visit our country, there is a lot of talk about the strength of our relationship, the bilateral aspects, the shared values, the shared interests. But that is something that the government wants the people to know. I want to know from you, are there any surprising elements or less discussed aspects of our relationship with these countries that you have found out in the course of your research, that you've mentioned in the book, and now you would like the reader or the viewer to know?
Yeah, so sometimes when you talk about values, for example, it's not only democracy or human rights or pluralistic societies, it's also similar kind of strategic outlooks. Now, in the case of one of our friends, for example, France, which is here, right, our number 1 strategic partner in Europe, we have this very interesting convergence around the idea of strategic autonomy. Not many other of our friends talk about this as much, but France does, and so do we. So if you look at that concept of strategic autonomy, I show in the chapter on France, India strategic partnership, how much of a binding glue it is, then you have other factors like, for example, the diaspora. Some of these countries have massive Indian diasporas. The US, more than 4 million, Australia, I think close to 1 million now, UAE, almost close to 4 million. So these three countries are especially, ripe for diaspora diplomacy, because the diaspora, Indian diaspora presence there, because they act as a lobby or as a influential constituency in those countries to strengthen the bilateral relations. Living bridge, as we say. But also they are also political players. Like in the US, for example, many of the landmark defense agreements and the strategic deals that we have signed over the last 15-20 years have been enabled by our diaspora there. So these are some of the elements I would say are additional over and above just the economic, military and the geopolitical factors that bring us close to these friends. Diaspora has become very significant in some of these countries. In some of these countries, it's also changing world order, and there are a lot of divisions, right? We already spoke about them, and there's doubt about the US's credibility of the US's commitments. With Donald Trump coming back to power, again the doubts will arise. So a lot of US allies actually look to India, not necessarily as a substitute or alternative to the US, but as a country that is useful to have on their side, because they need to have countries like India, because they can't be absolutely sure if China attacks them, who's going to be with us. If the US backs out, or if it is not, is vacillating, then we need more friends, right? So India is like an insurance policy also to many of these countries, and these countries are insurance policies for us too, because we can't also be absolutely sure about how far the US strategic partnership can help us.
So when you say these countries, you specifically mean Japan,
Australia, yeah. Some of the smaller ones. I haven't covered the strategic partnership with Indonesia or with Vietnam in the book because of paucity of space. But those kind of countries which are directly facing Chinese pressure can't be 100% sure about whether the US will have their back. So in a way, we come in because we are not the US. As Dr. Jaishankar famously said, we are not anti-West, but we are non-Western, right? Because we are non-Western, we are seen as less provocative by the Chinese comparatively, and we can, do a lot of things together to strengthen these countries, these friends of ours, to bolster their deterrence or their capabilities to resist any kind of military aggression or attack by the Chinese. So there are all these factors that, I think are additional to the basic three: economic, military, and geopolitical.
Among these seven, with some of these countries, we've had historical relationships, time-tested friendships can also be said between India and Russia. But a couple of these countries are those wherein until a decade ago, we didn't have a defined foreign policy. How has our foreign policy changed with regard to some of these countries like the UAE, like Israel in particular?
Yeah, UAE, Israel, and even Australia. The ones at the bottom here, these three, I would say are really new strategic partners. I mean, we have signed the strategic partnership with some of them more recently, and some are older, but in effect we have been able to capitalize on these friendships and take the mutually beneficial relations to higher level in the Modi period. I think if you see Israel, for example, Prime Minister Modi was the first Indian leader since independence to set foot in Israel and to do an official visit, and a lot of things that were taboo or happening behind the scenes with Israel have come into the open now, because we have dehyphenated it from domestic politics in India. That's a big change. And with Israel also, we have ramped up the counter-terrorism cooperation, advanced technology cooperation. There are some amazing things they are doing in India. I mean, people only think into Israel in terms of a hard state that is countering jihadists, but they also have extraordinary agro-scientists and agricultural techniques, and all across India they have set up these training centers where thousands of our farmers are being trained to improve their crop yield and productivity. So there are all kinds of things that we do with these countries which required that political will, which was absent in the pre-Modi period. So it's come in. UAE, there was only one leader in the whole world that Prime Minister Modi calls my brother. It's Mohammed bin Zayed, the ruler of the UAE, and again a country that has become very critical for us to push back against the Pakistani pressure on Kashmir. The UAE has played a very significant role for us, and I show that in the chapter. Our diaspora is there, like I said before, and Prime Minister has also mobilized UAE investments, sovereign wealth funds, and our strategic oil reserves. There are many things that we are doing with the UAE which no other country is willing to do, come this far. So moderate Islam and trying to spread a vision of a more inclusive and pluralistic societies, these are all big things that also help our image in the Islamic world, because the UAE is a Muslim majority country that supports India on all these matters, and does not question our narrative of India being a pluralistic democracy. So there are all these things that really work.
That's quite interesting, because what we've seen, especially in the last decade, is an assertive and independent foreign policy and something that's purely in India's interests. How difficult has it been for the Modi government to manage these divergent partnerships, and something that you've tried to show through the cover of your book as well?
Yeah, we call this multi-alignment. Multi-alignment has worked because a lot of dehyphenation. For example, Arab countries do not mind, or even Iran for that matter, which is not, do not mind that we have partnership with Israel, and Israel does not try to pressurize us to downgrade our relations with Iran or with Arab countries, right? Even though those two pairs are often at loggerheads. Russia and the US, this is of course the central fault line, and here also there were attempts to pressurize India to give up the Russian friendship, or to downgrade it, or to stop buying weapons, stop buying oil from them. We have not heeded those kind of diktats, and I've shown how we have managed to overcome those obstacles. Nobody has sanctioned us, even though there were threats of Western sanctions against India. And I think that's because, over time we do realize that the US and its allies need India because of the China challenge in the Indo-Pacific, and also because of the huge market. I mean, US-India trade is now, crossed $200 billion, and it's, galloping, and it will continue to grow despite potential protectionist winds under Donald Trump. So, who would want to let go of this kind of a market, So there are certain things we know are our strengths, and we capitalize on them and make sure that we are able to do this juggling act with the multi-alignment. The Russians themselves understand that we have a problem with China, even though they are not willing to help us explicitly on that matter. And they understand why we are in Quad. I mean, of course, the Russians say that there should not be any NATO-like structure in Asia, and the Russians often repeat the Chinese line because they are now so dependent on China. But nonetheless, that has not stopped the Russia-India pragmatic cooperation from continuing. So, what I'm trying to say is that we have certain stature today, this rising power stature, which is above middle power but not yet a great power, which makes us attractive to a lot of these countries. And they don't mind if we are quote unquote supping with the devil as per their schema. The other side is the devil, but if India is friends with them, it's okay, because end of the day, we are not allies of anybody, right? This is not a strict formal alliance. I've given the analogy of human relationship, like, a monogamous marriage versus, a live-in relationship which has less commitments, right? So, I think these strategic partnerships are more like live-in relationships with people you like, but it doesn't mean that you will not be friends with any other person, So that's how we have, that's how it's come about, this strategic partnership. They've become very popular in the last 20-25 years, not only with India. Many other countries sign these strategic, I show in the book, the US has its own strategic partnerships. China has dozens and dozens of strategic partnerships. So they're all doing it, and it's that kind of a fluid world order which is in transition. So everybody wants to keep the channels open to all sides, Even the Americans who say that China is the number one pacing rival and adversary, they also do many things that often strengthen the Chinese hand, And we get frustrated here saying that why are the Americans not harsher on China? So they try to also patch up with the Chinese when they want to. They do hedging also. Not only we are hedging. So in fact, Dr. Jaishankar said that now with Trump coming into power, there's going to be more hedging worldwide. So you may see more of these strategic partnerships rather than the tight alliances.
What about the China factor? That's another key theme in your book. The fact that we have a hot and cold relationship with China, despite India not needling China at all, despite a lot of analysts questioning why China chose to sour relations with India, even when the Prime Minister said that it's going to be a century for Asia where China and India can work wonders. How do you look at the India-China relationship in the coming times, and now especially with Donald Trump coming back in America?
Yeah, your viewers, Teena, would may be surprised to know that in the year 2005, around 20 years ago, we actually signed a strategic partnership agreement with China.
Yes.
In those days, there was no sense of a adversarial relationship, and this is the pre-Xi Jinping era. And China, the leadership, the Communist Party, and its ambitions were also not as muscular or as radical or as revisionist as they have become now. But over time, the relations have soured, and a lot of it has to do with the structural competition. We are in the same geographical space. They have grown faster. They started their modernization earlier. They became a much bigger economy than we are, and now we are catching up. We are growing faster than them. So the gap is going to close, at the current differential rates in another 10-15 years. We're going to be a lot closer to where China is in economic and military and overall power terms. So there will be some anxiety on their part to not share power. And this is this Chinese mentality. I mean, they have a zero-sum outlook. They think that they are the number one in Asia and in what they call Asia Pacific. They even refuse to accept the term Indo-Pacific because they think that's giving too much importance to India. So they don't want to concede, and their logic is that if somebody is going to catch up with us, we should try and repress them or try and prevent them from rising. And that's what they've been doing. That's why they have a all-weather friendship with Pakistan, and that's what they're doing in across South Asia and beyond to try and stymie India's rise, at every step. So even though, like you said, there is a tactical kind of agreement to de-escalate at one flashpoint of the line of actual control in the Himalayas, it doesn't mean that the overall structural rivalry and competition is going to die down. So my expectation is that, and these friends, these 7 countries, especially the Quad countries, and even France, which has a huge presence in Indian Ocean region, all of them are very vital for us to push back the Chinese expansionism. So China is in an expansionist phase of its history, and I don't see that being dialed down or being moderated or softened. They have resorted to ultranationalism. Xi Jinping's hold on power is indefinite, and he's...
So you mean the current developments that are taking place, you think that they are just a temporary measure? There's no intent on part of China to work towards a lasting peace at the border?
Yeah, I think, they have never settled the boundary question, as it's called. The overall, we've had like dozens of rounds of talks, and there's never any resolution. They continue to make lots of claims, what we call cartography aggression and all that. And more than just pieces of territory here or oceanic control in the Indian Ocean or beyond, for them it is about, they feel like India is part of a US web of partnerships or alliances to try and contain China's rise. So just as we feel that China is trying to contain our rise using Pakistan, the Chinese have the feeling that the US is trying to contain their Chinese rise by using India and other countries. So strategic partnership, US-India strategic partnership does worry the Chinese, because we are doing very advanced things, and I show that in the US-India chapter. Right. Despite our occasional differences, sometimes as democracies we are often critical of each other. US relationship is very central, and if you were to ask me, if I rank order these friends, who is your number one friend in the current era, it has to be the US. There's nobody else with those capabilities, with the intent to push back the Chinese. The others are all middle or small powers. So Chinese also apply pressure on India due to that reason, because they think that it's a way to warn India not to wander and to become too close to the US, too close for the Chinese comfort. So they really understand that in the Indo-Pacific, if the US-India relationship gets stronger, then it will put the Chinese on the back foot, because here are 2 big capable democracies, and if we are bringing all our assets together, especially in the military domain and in critical and emerging technologies and all these cutting edge fields, which we are doing now with the US, and the US is denying all those to China. There's a complete ban on these things now. It started with Trump, then Biden, and the Trump 2.0, you will see more of those walling off of advanced technologies to China. But on the other hand, they are willing to share with India to some extent. I mean, it's not full yet, but we are working on those aspects as part of the US-India friendship. So this is a critical factor which makes the Chinese, irate, because they think that India is either a junior partner of the US or is leveraging the US for its own advantage vis-a-vis China. So it's an undeniable fact, and that's why I think we have to be very wary of reaching any kind of early, premature judgments that okay, now all things are settled and it will be fine with China. I think the competition is going to continue growing, and that's why we'll need these friendships to be up to because we don't yet have the capabilities of a great power, right? So when a rising power, we need a lot of friendships to substitute for our lesser capabilities vis-a-vis China.
And for that, United States you rank as the number one. Coming to the US-India relationship, it has evolved in many ways, in many domains, as you rightly said. The question here is about the new president, the bonhomie that we have seen between Prime Minister Modi and Donald Trump. How do you see that once again translate the US-India relationship into taking it to greater heights? And especially in context of the thin line that you talk about in your book about freedom for one country, interference for the other, in the context of US-India relations.
Yeah, in fact, at my book launch, External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar said that some friends are more complicated than others. I think it was his way of mildly criticizing the American habit to poke their fingers and to wag at other countries, saying, there's something wrong with your internal politics and society and all that. But I think we are taking it into our stride, because in the Trump administration or the renewed Trump era, I don't think we will see a lot more of that, condescending kind of, holier than thou type of attitudes from the US. They are going to look at more the basics, the economic, the military and the geopolitical, which are the crucial things for the partnerships. In fact, the definition of strategic partners is that countries which are, like I said, prioritize interests more than values. So if at all there is a disagreement on values, we say, okay, you are a complicated democracy, we are a complicated democracy, and we understand. And by the way, I mean, the state of American democracy has not been ideal or a role model anyway. So for them to lecture to others. So I think it's okay. We will manage these problems and weather some of these occasional storms that happen. There's a lot of media heat, more heat than light, because there's a lot of, people get upset and angry over what the US is doing or not doing. But I think overall, we need to improve coordination. Under Trump, I'm expecting, and I've written my column in Hindustan Times the day after Trump got elected, that on Bangladesh, on Pakistan, on Afghanistan, our immediate and extended neighborhood, coordination with the US was not ample and not up to the mark in the Biden era. We were on like two different planets altogether. Our reading of the situation was different from theirs, despite having a lot of close consultations. They did their thing and it upset our interests, when Biden pulled out of Afghanistan, when the Sheikh Hasina regime was toppled in Bangladesh, we were not happy with the US role. So there is a problem. But again, if I were to say, okay, in a gigantic relationship, there will be some chinks here and there, and we have to try and paper over them and maintain the overall relationship, because the bigger picture is we have the China challenge, the bigger picture is our diaspora, the bigger picture is this expanding economic relationship. Our hope is that one day we'll have $500 billion or $1 trillion worth of trade with the US, because the convergences are so high, because our services sector and their corporate world are like umbilically linked. So there's so much that we can do together, and I think we should always have that broader strategic maturity and not get lost in occasional controversies and so on. We should keep our eye on the long race, the long challenge, which is for us to become a leading power. Without the US, how can we become? Already we have one great power, China, which is opposed to us. How can we also antagonize another great power, US? If both of them are against us, I think the game is lost. So we need the US on our corner, and that's important.
What about another key friend, which is Japan? During Shinzo Abe, our relationships soared to new heights, and the kind of camaraderie that we saw between the late Shinzo Abe and the Prime Minister, both in Tokyo, then again in Kashi, it's something that will live in our memory forever. But after Shinzo Abe, how have you traced the journey between India and Japan?
See, Abe's legacy is so great that Fumio Kishida, his successor, and then the new Japanese Prime Minister has just come in. All of them are continuing to deepen and to widen the strategic partnership with India. And now what has happened is, as a result of Abe's efforts, Japan is rearming. It is rebuilding its military and becoming quote unquote a normal country. For almost 70 years since World War II, they were simply relying on US security guarantees. Right. And focusing only on economic growth and prosperity. Now they realize, because the Chinese challenge is so big, and like I said, there is uncertainty about whether the US will really come to your rescue when, suppose the Chinese actually physically are trying to invade Senkaku Islands, which they claim and which is under Japanese control. They will need more friends than just the US, right? So I think the Japanese are now building up their military, and this is good news for us. It will also keep the Chinese contained on their eastern seaboard, so that they cannot concentrate all their assets to come into the Indian Ocean and to encroach into our spheres of influence in South Asia and in the and beyond. So Japan helps us in many ways. Our technological modernization, I talk about Dr. Jaishankar's famous phrase that Japan contributed to 4 revolutions in this country. Big, transformative revolutions. Our modernization is linked to Japan, and Japan is our close partner for the Northeast. Like I mentioned with the UAE in Kashmir, Japan is a big player for the Northeast of India, for its development and for our Act-East policy. Japan is the linchpin. Without Japan, we don't have the finances, we don't have the connectivity, we don't have the networks. So I think if you were to ask me in Asia, who is our number 1 strategic partner, it has to be Japan. There's nobody else that comes anywhere close.
Professor, you've spoken about how we have a lot of friends, 7 key strategic partners, but at the same time, our foreign policy is guided by the principle of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the world is one family, and we like to work as a force for global good. But in this deeply polarized world, how effective the role of India can be in the times to come to ensure that every faction works for larger global good? Because in this factionalism, what is being overlooked is the development of the global south. India did manage to emerge as a voice of the global south last year during its G20 presidency, but the fact that the work or the kind of agenda that India pushed for has to translate into outcomes.
Yeah, so we continue to support the G20 processes and the implementation of the agreements reached during the Delhi Declaration of 2023. We are also very much against the continuation of these senseless and prolonged wars, be it in the Middle East or West Asia or in Eastern Europe. Prime Minister Modi has made this phrase, "This is not an era of war," globally popular, and accepted. So we are trying to play a kind of a positive role to try and bring these armed conflicts to a close. We are not exactly quote unquote mediating, but we are facilitating and passing messages and all these things. So between different warring parties, we would like the Russia-US bad blood to subside, if not completely vanish, because the more Russia and the US clash, the more Russians are falling into the Chinese lap and becoming more and more dependent on China, which means the whole of Eurasia, we have an unfavorable balance of power. Russia is still our partner, but if it comes under Chinese duress and under pressure, will Russia continue to give us what we want? We are not sure. So that's why I want to emphasize that we are playing a constructive role. And through Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam and all that, of course, we also imply the messaging is more for the developing world, for least developed countries, as for the global south as a whole. And for them also, none of them has been covered here as a major strategic partner, because we don't gain as much from them, rather we give more to them. In this case, these countries we also receive a lot. So I would say our leadership role in the global south is also contested. China is there. The Chinese model, they also give out a lot of loans, and in fact much more than we do, and they have their checkbook diplomacy, they have the Belt and Road Initiative. So I would say to beat back that kind of a indirect kind of a expansionism of China across in Africa, in Latin America, all these places, we have to be present. We have to be present along with other countries. That's why I was, for example, with Japan, we're doing a lot of joint projects in third countries. That's how we are able to, in Sri Lanka, for example, or in Myanmar, or Bangladesh, or in Africa. So with France also, we need to team up in Indian Ocean territories where they have a presence. With Australia in the Pacific Island countries, because Australia has been dominant there historically, but Chinese are pushing them out and muscling in. So again, we have a lot in common. We are amping up our diplomacy with the Pacific Island country, the small island nations, and Australia and India together have to do it in coordinated fashion. So that's how, that's why I'm saying the friendships will matter more, even for our Vishwa Guru or Vishwamitra or Vasudhaiva Kutumbam. For all these to fructify, we can't be out there all on our own to face this mighty juggernaut called China, which is just throwing money around and buying loyalty. We need to go along with these friends. So the strategic partnerships are also going to be, in a way, enablers for our role as a Vishwamitra to be fulfilled in the global south.
So, as our influence, the sphere of influence is expanding in a lot of other countries where you said we have a lot of joint partnerships with countries. Our goodwill that India is generating through its work is also increasing. Will we have a second volume of the book, Friends, which will include a lot of other countries where we are just the givers and where we are working towards development partnerships?
It's so interesting, Teena. A lot of foreign diplomats who are based here in Delhi saw the cover of the book and saw the contents. They came to my launch and they've been reading it. They're saying it's amazing, but how come my country is not featured on it? When are you going to put country X or country Y on the cover? Why? We are also doing a lot with India and we deserve to be. So it's a nice place to be, a sweet spot geopolitically for India, where we are so wanted and desired by everybody, and we can be choosy as to who's really our best friend. So I think I'm not thinking of a second volume, but I usually, like my last book, Crunch Time, was about how we are facing our two adversaries, China and Pakistan. This one is about friends. We'll see what I come up with next. But I think the important point here is that these strategic partnerships are not set in stone or fixed in time. They evolve. Maybe in 5-10 years, if somebody, or I don't know, if I myself will do the endeavor of another book along these lines, only about friendships, we may have a different set of countries here. Some may even drop out of this list. We never know. I mean, China dropped out in 2005. China came in 2005 and I think it lapsed over time.
Gradually, yes.
We cannot call it our partner anymore. So
in fact, it's the biggest adversary today.
Biggest adversary. It's like from one corner to the other corner. There could be others who will come in. There are some with whom we have very promising relations right now. The UK wants to be here. It's nowhere compared to France in terms of our value, overall strategic value, but it wants to be seen, and maybe we can.
Diplomacy, indeed, you're right, is a very thin rope, and diplomats have to do a tightrope walking. That's
Indonesia, Vietnam, the ones I have not covered, we have strategic partnerships. Those may, we ramped up the Philippines. We have an opportunity actually. A lot of, apart from us, as a rising power, there are a lot of middle powers that are coming up in different parts of the world, and who are ambitious and who will want our hand of friendship, because we also enable them to rise in their areas.
Professor, book or no book, hopefully we'll talk about these middle powers in another edition of our podcast. But on a personal note, usually when I speak to authors, they describe this journey of writing a book as a journey also of discovery and rediscovery. Was there any point when you had a realization, or where you found out something that came across as a surprise to you, something that you would like to share with us and our viewers?
Yeah, I think in the process of writing Friends, what I realized is that it's such a fine balancing act that we do every day, to manage these relationships, and we should not take them for granted, like I said. And my sincere hope and my appeal to audiences also is to not to get carried away by controversies and occasional flaps we have with these countries, rather if we have a patient longer term view. One of the surprising things I'll share with you, and I mentioned that in the epilogue of the book at the end, called The Path of a Leading Power, is there is an old saying that there are no permanent friends in international relations, only permanent interest, right? But India actually is a kind of a state or a kind of a power that is affectionate and gives back a lot. It's not a grabby kind of a friend who's or someone who's who's dependent on our friends and is always a burden on them, right? So as a result of this, some of these friendships are very old. Like the one with Russia goes back to almost 70 years now, since the 1950s, 60s, right? And many of the other ones like 25, 30 years. So in other words, it's not like friends can just be discarded. Yes, some of them may drop out, become adversary like China has. But in general, you can actually have permanent friends, at least as long as India as a nation state exists, as long as this kind of environment exists in Indo-Pacific, this kind of geopolitical transition exists from post-Cold War to another era, which may last for another 20, 30 years. I expect that many of these will continue. So actually, it's a misnomer to think that friendships don't really matter and we should just pursue our core national interests and just use friends. Actually, my argument here is that friendships are long-lasting for a country like India. So in a way, what I discovered, the surprising thing, to come to your, the crux of what you asked me, is that the nature of India as a country or as a state or as a power in the world, this was a discovery for me. I set off initially saying, let me see what we are doing with all our main partners. But in the process, it all came back ultimately to what kind of a power is India. And so that's why we say India is a viable leader, a beneficial partner, and a dependable friend. There's the old proverb, tell me who your friends are and I'll tell you what kind of a person you are. So tell me who India's friends are and I'll tell you what kind of a power India is. So those who read this book will get a sense that it's not only about what we are doing individually with this country or that country. Ultimately, it's about what kind of power is India, why is it so unique, and why it's so great.
Right. So for those of you who have any interest in foreign policy, if you want to understand about who India's friends are, where our strategic interests lie, and who are the friends who will help us become a rising power, for that you have to read this book, Friends, by Professor Sreeram Chaulia. Thank you, Professor, for joining us on this podcast and giving us a comprehensive insight into what this book really is all about. And it's always a delight to speak to you about issues of foreign policy. Thank you once again for joining us on the Sansad TV podcast. To your viewers, thank you very much for your time as well.
To watch more programs of Sansad TV, subscribe to our YouTube channel and don't forget to like and share them.